Да. Коллеги, позвольте продолжить наш семинар и разрешите предоставить слово нашему следующему спикеру, господину Vahan Sirunyan. Он является экспертом в области бюджета и управления госфинансами в офисе ПРООН в Армении. У Вахана Сируньяна многолетний опыт работы, более 18 лет опыта работы в области управления государственными финансами, включая это Министерство финансов Армении, а также многолетняя работа в проектах различных международных организаций и международных финансовых институтов, таких как ПРООН, Всемирный банк, АБР, ЮНИСЕФ, GIZ. Да? Он также участвовал в проведении оценки ПЭФов в Армении. Вахан, он экономист по образованию, у него степень магистра по экономике Ереванского государственного института национальной экономики. Презентация Вахана посвящена презентации опыта Армении в вопросах климатической маркировки бюджета и маркировки бюджета на основе ЦУР. Мы как раз попросили, и Вахан любезно согласился представить их опыт, потому что он очень схож с тем, что мы планируем в Узбекистане делать, то есть в Армении, Армения одна из немногих стран, где вот идут два параллельных процесса, разрабатывается и внедряется методология маркировки, климатической маркировки бюджета и параллельно бюджет на основе ЦУР. И вот в Узбекистане мы тоже объединяем эти два процесса, и нашим коллегам было бы очень полезно услышать опыт Армении. Пожалуйста, Вахан, слово вам.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this interesting initiative. Yes. Can I continue? Okay.
Да, пожалуйста, Вахан, сейчас.
Yes.
Да.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this interesting initiative, and also let me share first of all my presentation. Okay. So, as you probably know, Armenia is relatively new in the area of climate change and SDG budget tagging, but still we've tried to implement both taggings simultaneously. And I think our experience could be interesting for our Uzbekistan colleagues, firstly because Armenia has already implemented program budgeting, and as I know, Uzbekistan is also going to implement the program budgeting in the budgeting process, and the system that was designed in Armenia is very well fit to the program budgeting environment. So I think our presentation could be really helpful for you to make decisions about the model that you are going to implement. But before presenting our Armenian experience in the area of SDG and climate change budget taking, before that, let me first present a little bit country context of Armenia to understand what's the environment. So Armenia is a relatively small country in the Southern Caucasus. Most of you probably know our colleagues. And there are some data on the screen you can see about Armenia. The economy is relatively small. The number of population is small, but the territory of Armenia is highly mountainous with small forest and water coverage, which means that Armenia is very prone to climate change risks. And that shaped the climate change environment or the context of Armenia. From climate change perspective, Armenia has contributed very little towards the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but the country suffers heavily due to the adverse climate conditions that is expected to worsen in future. The main climate risk-prone sectors are agriculture, water resource management, forestry, and in last decades, Armenia made significant steps in the area of climate change mitigation and adaptation by ratifying Paris Climate Agreement and many other international agreements and treaties in the area of climate change and environmental protection. Also adopted national determined contributions twice, once adopted and then reviewed recently, and also adopted and implemented many national strategies in the area of climate change mitigation and adaptation. In terms of SDG perspective, Armenia in 2015 has joined the UN Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, where conducted 2 voluntary national reports, and recently we finalized our DFA, but the country is still lacking in terms of SDG nationalization, which, as we will discuss later, is one of the main challenges in Armenia's SDG budgeting and tagging process. So what's the rationale and purpose of climate change and SDG budget tagging in Armenia? As our colleagues have already mentioned in their presentations, one of the main problems in the area of SDG budgeting is the weak connection or disconnect between SDG frameworks, national development planning, and budgeting processes. And the purpose of SDG budget tagging, specifically in Armenia, was to improve the alignment between SDGs and budgets by integrating and mainstreaming SDGs into the budgeting process, including the identification and measuring climate change and SDG-related budget expenditures, by trying to embed SDGs and climate change targets and indicators into the budget performance framework, by also trying to foster SDG and climate change informed budget discussions and decisions, and finally, by trying to embed SDGs and climate change related expenditures and performance reporting and enable the performance reporting and monitoring process in Armenia. As you can see on the slides, the activities on SDG budget tagging in Armenia started in 2020. The process is relatively new. And the first step towards this process was the conduction of climate change public expenditure and institutional review, so-called CPIR. Based on this CPIR, the climate budget tagging methodology was developed. And after that, the development of the introduction of SDG budgeting model started, which started in 2021 and still is ongoing. The lead agencies in this process were the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment. The latter was mainly involved in the CPIR and climate change related issues, while the Ministry of Finance was heavily involved and still is heavily involved in the process of SDG budget methodology development, budgeting, and pushing this process in the government. I have to mention here that the implementation of CPIR as a first step towards the SDG tagging was quite a crucial step in Armenia, as it made it possible right in the beginning to understand in practice all the granularities of cross-cutting policies and the challenges of their integration into the budgeting and PFM framework. Only after completion of these works concerning to climate change and CPIR and accumulation of relevant experience, the focus was shifted towards the SDG budget mapping and tagging in Armenia. In terms of SDG budget, SDG tagging, the first and important step towards this direction was that with the support of UNDP, the methodological instructions of budget were revised by the Ministry of Finance, and all the line ministries starting from 2021 were required to disclose in their budget proposals the link between the objectives of their budget programs and outcomes with the relevant SDG targets and indicators, and to include SDG indicators in the outcomes of new budget initiatives and programs whenever it's possible. And this was quite an interesting move, because in line ministries or general, there was no understanding that SDGs is part of the sectoral policy. And this move actually pushed the line ministries into the process. And also the support has been provided to line ministries by the UNDP experts to help them to find these links and to do the tagging. Similar requirements were set for all SDGs, as well as for some of the cross-cutting policies. Gender, COVID-19, post-conflict recovery measures, all these three kinds of policies were included in the budget instructions as cross-cutting policies, And for all these policies, there was a requirement to identify policy measures, indicators, and embed these indicators into the budget submissions, which makes it possible to analyze and make decisions on cross-cutting policies. Because as you know, in traditional budgeting system, cross-cutting policies are never introduced properly. And to make the process of the SDG budgeting more integrated into the budgeting framework, it was important to understand that cross-cutting policies are also part of our policies and needs to be considered respectively in the budgeting process. Now let's discuss the logic behind the SDG and climate change budget taking in Armenia. In these terms, the combination of two concepts is used to identify, classify, and tag climate change and SDG-related budget expenditures in Armenia. Those concepts are the purpose and impact of budget expenditures. The concept of purpose takes into account the purpose and objective of budget expenditure. In other words, whether it takes into account whether the budget program or measure is implemented primarily or explicitly to ensure the SDGs or climate change mitigation or adaptation goals. The concept of impact, in contrary, takes into account the expected outcomes or impacts of budget expenditures on the SDGs or climate change, mitigation and adaptation, regardless of the stated objective, the budget program and measure. And this combination of two concepts of purpose and impact makes it possible to identify and tag all expenditures related to SDGs and climate change mitigation and adaptation, both directly or indirectly related to them. Moreover, this logic is very well supported by the program budgeting concept, as it aims to link the budget expenditures with policy goals and targets. And we know that SDGs are eventually a group of policy goals, targets, and outcome indicators. Hence, the program budgeting and SDGs are very well connected to each other and both support to each other in terms of the logic. I have to mention here that the introduction of program budgeting in Armenia was an important factor in terms of development of described methodology. In case of program budgeting, you know that budget expenditures are presented grouped around the policy objectives, which makes it possible to identify the main objectives of budget expenditures, expected outcomes, and subsequently facilitates the identification of SDG and climate change related expenditures from budget documentation. Of course, only budget documentation are not enough to see the linkage between the policies for SDGs and the budget expenditures. Still, a lot of technical work needs to be done to identify the links, but at least budget structure in terms of program budgeting, the program classifier makes it possible to identify and group all the expenditures around the goals and makes it easier to embed SDGs into the budgeting framework and make your program more SDG informed and more SDG aligned. Now let's see how this logic works in terms of climate budget taking model in Armenia. As you can see on your screens, there are logical steps of climate change budget taking in Armenia. You can see that there are 4 groups of climate change expenditures are identified, and those are identified based on their relevance to climate change mitigation and adaptation. As a first step, the concept of purpose implemented to identify expenditures that are being undertaken explicitly or primarily because of their climate benefits. These expenditures are classified in the first category, the first line, as directly relevant ones, and from 75 to 100% of these expenditures are considered as climate change expenditures. For the remaining 3 categories, the concept of impact is implemented, and these expenditures are classified in one of those groups based on the level of climate benefits that are generated. And the respective percentage of those expenditures are considered climate change expenditures. The more climate change benefits are expected, the more percentage of expenditures are considered as climate change relevant. So we conclude the first group includes all the expenditure whose primary purpose is climate change, and the other three groups includes expenditures whose primary purpose is not climate change, but there is some demonstrable internationally acceptable evidence that these activities will generate high, moderate, or low level of benefits related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Next slide shows how this logic of climate change budget taking is embedded into the budgeting system. To make it possible to include or embed climate budget taking into the budgeting framework, the budget classifier was introduced. Three main criteria are used to classify climate change expenditures in Armenia. You can see on the screen. The first is the nature of climate change response, mitigation or adaptation. The second criteria takes into account the level of climate change relevance. 4 levels of relevancies that I've already mentioned. And the third criteria is the climate change strategic policy area. To make it easier, the identification, classification, and measurement of climate change related expenditures, typology of climate change related activities have been developed. It is largely based on the international experience in identifying climate change related activities. And for this purpose, the MDB list of climate change related activities, EU taxonomy have been used. And this typology helps those people who are involved in the process easily find activities that are related to climate change, classify them, and find specific percentages of expenditures that needs to be allocated to one or the other groups and to the climate change expenditures. On the right part of the screen, you can see the draft classifier, which consists of 5 digits. The first 3 digits of which represents climate strategic policy area code. The first out of which is the climate change response code. And the last 2 digits are for climate change relevance. I have to mention that at this moment, climate change expenditure classification and coding system is still under the development and is not finalized yet. But this is the logic that we are currently pushing forward and we are elaborating on. One more important aspect that I would like to mention before moving to SDG budgeting, SDG tagging logic is that in Armenian case, climate change tagging is implemented or the classifiers are applied at budget policy action level. Budget policy action is the second level of program classifier under the program budgeting framework, which is the appropriation level, which shows the type or the level of government intervention and in this respect, this logic of tagging on the policy action level or budget appropriation level makes it possible to consider to do cost allocations in the budgeting process. And I have to mention that this program classifier is not the traditional classifier. It's not the functional or economic classification line. It's a pure program classification approach, which is one of the unique approaches in Armenia that we have unique situations in Armenia. And this much about climate budget tagging. Now let's speak about SDG budget tagging approach in Armenia and how this logic works with the SDGs. As with the climate budget tagging, the SDG budget tagging is also based on the principle of purpose and impact. As a first step, all budget programs and policy actions are mapped to identify their relevance to SDGs. The concept of, and in this respect, 2 groups of SDGs are identified, primary and secondary SDGs. The concept of purpose is used to identify primary SDGs, and the concept of impact is used to identify secondary SDGs for each policy action. Primary SDGs are used for SDG tagging and cost allocation, while the secondary SDGs are used for policy decisions, but not for budget tagging and not for cost allocation in terms of SDG tagging. Each policy action is linked to one primary SDG. So it's one of the challenges in our model that due to the cross-cutting nature of SDGs, we need to identify one and the most important SDG that is primarily linked with the specific policy actions. And in terms of secondary SDGs, there is no limitation in terms of secondary SDGs, but it is required to find no more than 5 SDGs. And the secondary SDGs are important to identify what kind of impacts policy actions or the budget expenditures may have in budgeting, may have on the SDGs. And based on these impacts, it makes it possible to do thematic taggings like climate change budget tagging or gender-based budget tagging or the other type of budget taggings if the government goes for this kind of taggings. So again, as you can see, the tagging is implemented on the budget policy action level. And in this respect, the cost allocation is implemented the way that if we identify one or the other primary SDG, the whole amount of the whole cost of the program is fully allocated to these SDGs. So this is the approach that we implement in Armenia. SDG classifier is also introduced. This is also a draft classifier. And it is very simple. It just represents the SDG target code. Oh, I forget to mention that the tagging process in Armenia is implemented on the second level of SDG framework. We make the tagging on the SDG target level, not on the SDG level. For example, we use SDG 1713 rather than SDG 17. And also we do not tag on the indicators level because at this moment, indicators are not embedded into the policy framework. And for many line ministries, it will be just an artificial process to make this kind of taggings. But in all cases where it is possible, all the line ministries are advised to include and to revise their performance indicators to include SDG indicators into their budgeting performance framework. Again, this tagging model is still under the development. It's in the piloting stage, and in the future it can be revised a little bit. And finally, let me show how the SDGs and climate change budget taggings and classifiers are interconnected. Although both the SDG and climate change taggings and classifiers are independent of each other, and they can be used separately, but they are also very well interconnected. As we have already discussed, a similar concept of purpose and impact is implemented for both taggings. And both taggings and classifiers are applied to the same level of budget policy action, appropriation, which makes it possible to link them. And on the table, you can see, examples how the different combinations of program purpose and impact are used to make taggings. For example, on the first line, you can see a case where the purpose of budget expenditures, climate mitigation and adaptation. And in this case, both in case of SDG tagging and in case of climate change by the budget tagging, these expenditures will be considered as climate relevant. In both cases, there will be because of the purpose. The purpose is climate change. In both cases, the respective 100% of the expenditures will be allocated to climate change. On the second level, on the second row, you can see a case where the purpose is not climate relevant, but there is a climate impact expected from these expenditures. In this case, in the SDG tagging, this will be considered as the primary SDG will not be climate change related SDG, will be a different SDG, non-climate SDG, and all the costs will be considered as fully relevant to these SDGs. But in terms of climate change budget tagging, these expenditures will be considered as climate relevant, and respective percentages of the cost will be allocated to climate change based on the level of impact. So this is the logic, how these systems work together. So we embed two systems in a way that we have general tagging of SDGs based on the purpose, and we have also thematic taggings of climate change based on the impact and purpose. So this is the way how system works in Armenia. And before concluding my presentation, let me briefly present the key challenges and lessons learned from the SDG and climate change budget tagging experience in Armenia. As we have already discussed, the slow progress of SDG nationalization is one of the main constraints in terms of SDG budgeting in Armenia. Probably Armenia is one of the unique countries where SDG budgeting process is initiated in the environment where SDGs are not nationalized. And because of this, many of the line ministries do not consider SDGs as part of their sectoral policy agenda. And there is no motivation in many of the ministries to do these taggings because simply it's not part of their agenda. Second problem is that the complexity of SDGs and budget programs is another challenge. And this is because it's sometimes very difficult to identify the primary SDGs for the programs. And in these cases, of course, expert judgment is largely used. And the third issue that I would like to mention is the institutional coordination. We need to take into consideration that Ministry of Finance role is very important here, but the Ministry of Finance alone cannot do the whole process of tagging, and especially if it concerns to the thematic taggings like climate change or gender-based or the other kind of thematic taggings. The inclusion of all ministries and commitment from the government is very important in this respect. In the Armenian case, line ministries are obliged to do this because Ministry of Finance required in the instructions that they have to follow these rules, provide the information to the Ministry of Finance, and there was a support from the UNDP to do this process. But if we come to the normal situation, it should come from, there should be some buy-in from in the National Assembly and which should be reflected. And also the SDG should be part of the national policy and should be part of the sector policies to push the process forward. And also the last thing that I would like to mention is the program budgeting. As you can see, the program budgeting is a major enabling factor in terms of SDG and climate change budget taking, as it makes it possible to link policies and SDGs with budgets. So it is very encouraging that in Uzbekistan, you also try to implement program budgeting, which will open for you great opportunity to look on the SDGs from policy, from goals perspective, rather technically link your expenditures with these goals. This much, dear colleagues, my presentation took a little bit longer than was expected. Thank you for your time and attention, and we'll be happy to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Vahan, спасибо огромное за очень интересную презентацию и вообще интересный опыт Армении. И для нас, для контекста Узбекистана тоже ваш опыт очень интересный. Мы уже до этого говорили, да, вот мы тоже пытаемся одновременно провести вот две эти реформы, как внедрить методологию бюджетирования на основе ЦУР и зеленое бюджетирование, и, может быть, для начала климатическую маркировку бюджета. Да? Коллеги, пожалуйста, если у кого есть вопросы, Ваган рад будет ответить. Да, пожалуйста, представьтесь, пожалуйста.
My name is Begzat Ulogov, and I work at the Ministry of Finance at the State Budget Department. I actually have questions to Mr. Vahan. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was very fruitful and it was very full of information. My question regards the following. Is just I would like to know about more of a costing method in your country in terms of when you have a budget programs let's say in the area of climate change. Could you tell me about more of how you appropriately identify your baseline expenditure for a typical one program? Because usually you need to, first of all, in baseline expenditures, definitely you will have your list of expenditures that you have to provide the expenditures. And I would like to understand how you, in terms of classifications, how you allocate those, identify those baseline expenditures, and also when you in Uzbekistan, let's say we have our financial system is divided into 4 categories. Let's say it has first, second, third, and fourth categories. And usually the first category has the majority, which is a salary. When you divide it, when you allocate it into programs, for our cases, majority, as I said, is salary. And how do you allocate salaries in budget programs? Do you have, let's say, in climate change programs, do you allocate also the salaries included in there as well, let's say, or is it just separately allocated in let's say, in administrative programs? And also, let's say, during the year, let's say you have a new initiative or new policy documents are being approved, and let's say in the area of climate change, do you separately create a new budget programs in that, or do you add into the current program that you have in the climate change program? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. This is quite an interesting question. Typical Ministry of Finance question, because it's yes, these are the issues that are connected with the program budgeting concept, as I understand. You would like to understand that what's the baseline of the program budgeting in Armenia, and also how we deal with the program with the climate change expenditures in terms of budget discussions and inclusion in the budget. As I have already mentioned, this model has. We developed the model, but it is not fully embedded into the budget system already. So it's in a piloting stage. So we cannot say as a final how the system works finally. But in terms of budget, let me answer to your first part of your question. Of course, we have in Armenia we have 4 types of classifiers. Yes, traditional COFO classifiers. Economic classification, administrative and functional classifications, and also program classifier, which shows the purpose and the outcomes of the expenditures, and also there's an information about performance output information there. For each of the policy action, we definitely identify its economic content and go deep into the line items. But we have to know that this is about, we're talking about in the IFMS system, we input this information, but in the budget documentation, National Assembly approves on the level of program policy action. And then the government approves the budget beneath that on the level of economic classification. So when we take the budget expenditures, climate budget expenditures, we take it first of all on the level of program policy action, which means that automatically we take all this to the lowest level of in the system. We have to take to the lowest level of economic classification. But when we consider which expenditures are climate relevant, we do not segregate economic classification items here, because it doesn't matter. It is a salary or those are tax expenditures. All these expenditures are meant for climate change or for the SDGs. So the purpose is the same. That's why all the expenditures are equally considered as climate relevant, and all the relevant percentage of these expenditures are considered climate or not climate relevant. So this is the answer to your first question, which concerns how we deal with the programs that are climate relevant. This is a difficult question because we should come from the point who is the ministry that is, what is the ministry responsible for these expenditures? Because climate change expenditures are mostly cross-cutting expenditures. So if we are talking about expenditures in the area of energy, that could be related to the Ministry of Energy, and also that could be considered as part of the climate change mitigation policy. And in this case, we need to understand that in many cases, line ministries who are responsible for these expenditures, they classify these expenditures as expenditures that are related to their specific sectoral policies. And then through the tagging, we identify how these expenditures are linked to the budgeting, to the climate change or the other SDGs. This process is done at this moment out of the budgeting system. It is not out of GFMIS system, but in general, the logic is that there should be some coordination process and quality control process in terms of climate change budget taking. So the line ministry, which is responsible for climate change policy development, this ministry should have a chance to look at this tagging process and make quality control. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just a question for myself and just information for myself as well. Your government, what's the outlook for your government to follow in terms of budget programs? Like in a, let's say, are you trying to implement intergovernmental programs or just typical budget programs within the ministries itself? Because I know, like Russia implemented its as an intergovernmental structure, and I don't think it's a very useful. It's one of the I don't think it's implementing intergovernmental budget programs not very successful as well. But for our cases, our plans, Ministry of Finance, what we are planning is we are aiming to only develop a budget programs within the ministries itself, because it's a more appropriate to the structure that we have in the PFM structure.
Yes, thank you for your question. This is about program budgeting logic that we use in Armenia. We actually, our system at this moment, the system is, like you have mentioned, we don't have cross-cutting programs in our budgets, because there should be some clear responsibility for delivery of the program outcomes and outputs. But before then, we had a system where we had cross-cutting programs, and there were many ministries responsible for part, each was responsible for its part of the budget of this program and policy actions, and there was no clear responsibility for delivering the program outcomes. And in the end, we end up with the logic that the only option to move really towards the program and performance management is to have clear responsibility for programs. And afterwards, our system was designed in a way that each program should have clear ministry which is responsible for the program delivery, and which doesn't make it impossible other line ministries to be involved in delivering several or one or the couple of policy actions under that programs. But again, the line ministry, which is the responsible ministry for this program, should have the right of, as a chief budget allocation manager, to make decision, to give this money and to make decisions about budget performance and results. So this is the logic that we use in Armenia based on our experience. Yes, we had this system of cross-cutting programs, which we abolished a couple of years ago, and we moved to the clear responsibility for the program. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answer as well.
Пожалуйста, Шахру.
So, good afternoon. My name is Shahruh Shankulov from Ministry of Finance, say Budget Department. So, my interested point is that introducing the SDG goals and the climate change in the budgetary process. So you mentioned as a goal, integration of the SDG and climate change in the budget preparation process. But inside, you also mentioned about the reporting based on these SDGs and climate change by tagging the expenditures. And you mentioned some the projects regarding the classification with the based on SDGs and climate change. So my point is that, so how about the Armenian practices? Did you change the whole preparation and reporting process from the traditional to the based on SDG, or you just add to your traditional process the SDG? Is it the additional process or additional work for you for nowadays in the real practice? And what do you think is just I want to know your opinion as well. What do you think? Is it better to take the I think let's say tagging the expenditures or labeling expenditures based on the SDGs, or identifying or classifying the expenditures with the climate change, just making in the beginning, I mean the preparation process, not the reporting process. So am I clear?
Yes, thank you. As I've mentioned earlier, if with the Armenian case, we are still in the piloting process. So we have not fully implemented the reporting part, but we designed in the methodological instructions requirement for line ministries to provide information about the cross-cutting policies and SDGs that could be combined into the report. So at this stage, we don't have reportings implemented fully, and which concerns budget discussions, yes, we in the Armenia, there was a requirement for the line ministries to provide information for new initiatives, especially that about the SDGs and about climate change and other cross-cutting parts. But at this moment, I cannot say that we succeeded with the budget discussions about this climate change and especially about the SDGs, because the information which comes from line ministries is at this moment, we don't have enough quality of information to do this kind of discussions. And ministries are also not ready to do these discussions because first of all, they are not part of the policy framework. And first of all, they need to be part of the policy framework to start these discussions. And but it's a process, evolving process. So step by step, the process will go on. And if information appears, ministries will get involved in the process, and eventually budget discussions will be there. Which concerns to the second part of your question. Could you please repeat the second part? I lost a little bit concentration.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I wanted to know that your opinion about is it better to leave at the beginning process of the budget? I mean, at the preparation process. So labeling the expenditures and classifying the expenditures based on the climate change.
Yeah.
Is it better just at the beginning process and continue with the traditional process?
Yes, I think yes. I think this is important that the climate change information is embedded into the budgeting framework right from the beginning. So it makes it possible to make budget decisions also informed with climate change information. Otherwise, the process will be very artificial if you add the information in the final stage and, for example, prepare a budget and then see what part of this budget is climate related or not. So my suggestion or my advice will be to the extent possible to start the process right from the beginning, to force the budget discussions around the climate indicators, and also make it possible for line ministries to take into consideration these cross-cutting policies while making policy decisions. Because otherwise, I don't see any other option to effectively integrate into the budgeting system and make it possible fully to have fully integrated climate change policy into the budgeting framework. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ван, спасибо за вашу презентацию. Айнура Бакайбаева, Министерство финансов, Госбюджет. Мы с вами не первый раз встречаемся уже, и все равно, сколько бы вопросов мы вам не задавали, все равно у нас вопросы с каждым, по-моему, разом все глубже и глубже затрагивают тематику ЦУР и зеленого бюджетирования. По поводу продолжения тех вопросов, которые мои коллеги до этого задали, таким образом, армянский Минфин отчитывается перед парламентом по вопросам вот SDG и изменения климата. То есть если готовятся какие-то определенные отчеты, если есть уже реформа, которая продолжается уже на протяжении 3-4 лет, то есть есть ли какая-то отчетность, которую используют парламентарии в каких-то фракциях, допустим, для обсуждения определенных вопросов, для выделения количества бюджетных ассигнований на следующие финансовые годы.
Спасибо за вопрос. Okay, let me answer in English. Thank you for your question. And no, at this moment, we don't have any reporting to the National Assembly. And also there is no discussions in the National Assembly concerning SDGs and also climate change. And as I have already mentioned, we are in a process of piloting. So at this moment only, process is within the government. But of course, we clearly understand that we cannot succeed with this process without having National Assembly's clear commitment over this process and lead over this process, because we are talking about goals, we are talking about results. And the National Assembly is the main institution which is really, which should be at least really interested in this aspect and policy results and policy outcomes. Yes.
Ван, и в продолжение нашей дискуссии я хотела уточнить по поводу бюджетной классификации. Вы на протяжении почти что половины презентации как раз показывали ту бюджетную классификацию, которую используют все наши страны, по большому счету, функциональную, экономическую и так далее. То, что вы сейчас в качестве моделей внедрения ЦУР и зеленого бюджетирования внедряете в Армении, это будет изменением в нормативный документ по применению бюджетной классификации той, которая есть, либо это будет какой-то отдельный документ, который будет учитывать только ЦУР и изменение климата. Я конкретизирую свой вопрос в плане того, что вы предполагаете, что это будет бюджетная программа. То есть, исходя из этой бюджетной программы, идет деление на цели ЦУР и уже деление по климатической маркировке. То есть вот здесь идет привязка к бюджетной программе. Поэтому я и уточняю, то есть это будет изменение и дополнение той существующей бюджетной классификации, которая есть, с дальнейшей ее детализацией, либо это будет какой-то совершенно отдельный документ с с отдельным подходом, именно учитывая программное бюджетирование и дальнейшее его актуализацию на ЦУР и на зеленые.
Thank you for your question. To be honest, at this moment, it is not clear how we will move forward with the classification, but I have to mention that we need to be very clear that what do we mean under program classifier? It's part of the routine classification. It is not over the other classifications. It is implemented in parallel to other classification, and it is an independent classifier. In terms of SDG classifiers and climate change classifiers, we consider them as independent classifiers that can be used, either embedded into the chart of accounts or in parallel to the chart of accounts, depending on how well we can move forward with the integration of these classifiers into the system. But what is important is that these classifiers will not be used separately as something like routine classifiers of economic classification. There should be addition to existing classification system. In Armenia, classification systems are adopted by Ministry of Finance order, and all these classifiers are adopted by Ministry of Finance order. And in terms of legal perspective, we consider that if and when the Ministry of Finance makes decision that we move forward with these classifications, then we will have a ministry order that will define these classifiers. And yes, that's my answer.
И еще, извините за количество вопросов, Ван. Как вы думаете, лично ваше мнение, как специалиста, который много лет работает в реформе госфинансов? Узбекистан только внедряет систему программного бюджетирования. Насколько это будет для нас правильно, не внедрив до конца программное бюджетирование, начинать внедрение ЦУР и зеленого? Возможно ли это, чтобы это было параллельным процессом? Либо, по вашему мнению, это нужно делать поэтапно. Сначала полностью разобраться с внедрением программного бюджетирования и вот этих всех инновационных моментов в бюджетном процессе, и потом уже пытаться надстраивать вот эту систему деления по ЦУР.
Yes, very interesting question, actually. Okay. It's very hard to answer which should come first, but to me, if you have a program budgeting environment, it's actually right in the beginning. It helps you to really understand how to move forward with your SDG budgeting process. But the SDG budgeting is part of the program budgeting, because we are talking about goals. The SDGs are goals, targets, nothing else. And the program budgeting is the process of linking programs or policies with policy goals with programs, with the budget. So in these terms, they are mutually supporting. There is no contradiction between these two logics. And if you try to implement also cross-cutting policies and consider cross-cutting policies while you are designing your programs under the program budgeting system, it will be only helpful to the program budgeting, and also it will help you to understand in terms of budget decisions that there are not, when you design your program budgeting system, that there are not only programs that are agency specific, but there should be, you have to consider cross-cutting issues when you design your programs and make it possible your system work in a way that we take into consideration also the cross-cutting policy objectives and results. To me, yes, the answer is that they can be started in parallel and they will support each other, but you can go also with the program budgeting and then make decision. But to me, the first option is the best option. So because you may end up with a design that will not support these cross-cutting issues. And in the end, you have to think how to change your system and adapt it to these cross-cutting policies. So having option of considering cross-cutting right in the beginning, cross-cutting issues will be a better approach to me. Thank you. I think our colleagues have raised hands. Please.
Да, Сурен, как раз я хотел попросить, чтобы, наверное, вы тоже бы ответили на этот вопрос. Пожалуйста, Сурен.
Да, спасибо. Да, я поднял руку до того, как Ваган последнюю свою мысль высказал, потому что я именно в этом ключе хотел сказать. У меня более четкая позиция. Я думаю, необходимо параллельно делать, не дожидаться. Как минимум по двум причинам. Во-первых, реформа по внедрению программного бюджетирования займет не менее 5 лет, а то и больше. Это согласно опыту всех стран, которые этим занимались. И причем даже спустя 5 лет, когда будет какая-то система уже внедрена, все равно идеальной ситуации не достигнуть в течение 50 лет. То есть ожидать полноценного окончания внедрения программ бюджетирования и после этого только ориентироваться на ЦУР или другой я бы не советовал. Во-вторых, есть еще один очень важный аспект. Я думаю, Ваган тоже немножко затронул этот аспект. Если посмотреть если разделить сам процесс по управлению вот этими изменениями, да, по внедрению программы бюджетирования, там несколько пластов работ. И по институциональной, и по ролевым разбивкам, и по классификациям, по информационным системам, по индикаторам эффективности и так далее, и так далее. Одним из ключевых вопросов методологии разработки программы бюджетирования является, что является программой, вот сама структура, что мы воспринимаем под программой. И если у нас есть уже логика, философия ЦУР на государственном уровне, если она принята, то имеет прямой смысл увязывать вот эту философию, вот эту структуру ЦУР с программно-целевой структурой вот этого классификации бюджетных программ. А то получится нестыковка. Возможно, у вас будут программы разработаны на один, а может и даже 2 уровня ниже, чем логика ЦУР под собой представляет. И тогда эту неувязку будет еще труднее потом увязывать. А цена разработки вот, программной структуры, которая была бы созвучна с ЦУР, она очень небольшая. То есть если эксперты Всемирного банка, работающие вот в PIU, да, в Project Implementation Unit, если вот эти методологи будут знать, что есть спрос на привязку с ЦУР, уже на этапе разработки структур программ они это будут принимать во внимание. И тогда вы убьете 2 зайцев сразу же. То есть у меня, как я уже сказал в начале, более четкая позиция. Надо обязательно не терять времени, не имеет смысла терять времени и параллельно это внедрять. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое, Сурен. Альмудена тоже хотела добавить, да, пожалуйста. Пожалуйста, Альмудена.
Yes, thank you. I think that this question is very relevant, and I totally agree that it must be in parallel. But also I want to point out something that is very important, is to think about the reform as a process and as a sequence. For example, when you map the budget of a country, that has a fully implemented budget program, you will see that there are different kinds of programs. Some of them are like instrumental or more administrative, and some of them are like management and real program-based budget. So, and in this regard, you use the logic framework to design the allocation of resources. Then you prepare a panel of performance indicators. But also the development of these programs is very different. For example, there are areas in which performance information is very relevant at one moment for a government, or it is aligned with the priorities, and you find that these programs are like the imagine 10 key programs of a country, and in this regard, the country and the Ministry of Finance is doing an extra effort in order to provide information. So what I try to say is that it is something that you can certainly align with green budget, with green initiatives, with SDGs, and you must do it one at a time, because then it is not, even if the full budget is not fully aligned with the logical of the program-based budgeting, at least having part of it is an effort, is a sign, and is something that is relevant in order to later on include more programs into the system. So I totally agree. Just when you are involved in one reform, if you take on board all the elements, you will find also synergies. So yeah, that's what I can say from my experience, and I hope that you find this also encouraging to all the budget directorate to have the energy to fulfill this challenging reform.
Спасибо большое, Альмудена. Коллеги, есть еще вопросы?
Если позволите, у меня тоже есть вопрос.
Да, пожалуйста, Зарина, пожалуйста. Зарина, представьтесь, пожалуйста.
Рожденова Зарина Харидзиновна, я доцент Банковской финансовой академии. Огромное спасибо всем докладчикам за очень интересные содержательные презентации. У меня, вы знаете, вот в плане того, что это не столько вопрос, сколько размышления по ходу. Дело в том, что в условиях внедрения вот как раз-таки рекомендуемого вами, значит, изменения климата и экологических проблем в, значит, наше бюджетирование представляется важным учитывать и специфику Узбекистана, которая заключается в том, что не все регионы на сегодняшний день в первоочередном порядке должны вот, быть ориентированы с точки зрения территориального аспекта, я имею в виду, должны быть ориентированы на вот перевод именно на, значит, данную методу бюджетирования, то есть принятие решения вот по отдельным регионам, оно будет, должно строиться, скорее всего, с учетом специфики этих регионов. Вы знаете, что у нас вот как раз-таки Приоралье территории вот и Хорезмской области, и Каракалпакстана, и Бухарской области, вот они будут требовать, скорее всего, первоочередного, так сказать, уделения внимания в этом аспекте, нежели другие территории. Есть ли опыт зарубежных стран при внедрении именно вот этих вот методов с точки зрения вот той проблемы, которую я сейчас подняла, именно не общий бюджет построить, а именно сделать упор на местные бюджеты в рамках внедрения этих элементов? Спасибо.
Зарина, спасибо большое, спасибо за комментарий ваш.